So I'm originally from Canada, but in the late 70s, my dad, along with lots of other Canadian doctors, moved down to the West Texas town of El Paso. Grew up in El Paso, left El Paso to go to college at UT Austin, and then went to Texas Tech for law school. I've been a licensed lawyer in the state of Texas since 2002. So I'm going on almost 20 years. I practice exclusively family law. Prior to moving to Austin, I was an associate court judge in El Paso and handled 90% of the protective orders that were filed in El Paso County, and then all of the family law matters that arose out of those protective orders. For a period of time, I also handled the Child Protective Services Court in El Paso County as well. It became a little overwhelming, and hearing the horrible stories that you hear every day. And
Hmm.
I had three young boys, and I couldn't do it anymore. And so I left the bench and moved out here, and started my practice all over again. I was fortunate enough to be hired by the city of Lakeway as one of their associate municipal court judges, and so I've continued, at least in that aspect, of still having the black robe to some extent, but I have a full blown family law practice.
When first off, thank you for the work that you did in helping those who got the protective orders keep and maintain those protective orders. One of the things that one of the obstacles I always run into. So one of the things that my firm provides is we do um, pro bono work for domestic violence advocacy groups. I mean, obviously not they're not in advocacy of domestic violence; they're in advocacy of the survivors of domestic violence. Sometimes that gets confusing when you say it out loud. But one of the challenges that we always have when talking with lawyers, either family lawyers or law enforcement, is that it's very easy to get a temporary restraining order, but it's very difficult to get the full restraining order. From first off, from your experience on the bench, is that a valid statement?
On my time on the bench, I disagree. I found on the ones that needed protective orders, we routinely granted the full term protective orders, either 2 years, or the law changed, at least in Texas back in 2011 or 2013, that allowed for certain crimes to have lifetime protective orders. And so quite often I granted lifetime protective orders.
And is that what is the So I know that one of the problems that when we're dealing with law enforcement or that when we're dealing with public defenders or what have you is that unfortunately a lot of times the people who fire those restraining orders don't show up to that initial hearing. They are trying to use those those temporary restraining orders, those TROs, as almost like a bargaining chip, a negotiating tool to get the abuser to stop. Is that why you think the stats kind of skew in the favor of it's harder to get, or
So I actually think there's more to it, to not showing up for court, than simply they're using it as a leverage. Some of them don't have the resources. Some of them have immigration status issues that make them afraid to go to court. And honestly, it is hard to sit in a courtroom and sit 6 feet, 8 feet away from the person that's been physically harming you for the last however many years. And so it is so much more than just they want to use it as leverage. I think that's probably the lesser of what happens. I think it's the access to get into court and standing up for themselves becomes the real challenge. And for some, it's just too much to handle. And so they figure if they get that 2 week protective order, that 14-day protective order, okay, I'm out, I'm good. But that's
that's enough to
unfortunately
give
not
them the
the case.
time and distance and excuse to get away from them and whatever. So would a correct parallel be that that's also why like so many like rapes and sexual assaults don't go to court is because the victim doesn't want to be you know re-traumatized by that same experience or in close proximity to that assaulter.
Fortunately, I can say I've not been the victim, as so many unfortunately have been. And I can only imagine how difficult it is to go to court and stand up in front of a room, if you're in front of a jury of 12 people or even in front of a judge, and say, this person did X, Y, and Z to me, and then be cross examined by that person's attorney. It's hard enough to even realize that you've been through that trauma, let alone having to verbalize it. And then
Is there
someone trying to trivialize it on the
Right now,
defense.
I know that, like, by the Constitution, like, you have a right to face the person who is bringing charges against you, you have a right to confront them in court. But are there any protections for domestic violence or intimate partner violence? Which do you think that the family courts could put some kind of a safeguard in place where it's like, hey, we're going to hear your side and then we'll hear his side, but there's no need for them to be in court together?
Okay, so interesting. Protective orders don't, at least in Texas, I can't tell you about the other
Right.
jurisdictions.
Every state is different, of course.
At least in Texas, protective orders don't fall under the whole you have a right to confront your accusers because they're actually not criminal actions, they're civil actions. And so there, in theory, could be ways to do it. I know that most courts, when you have protective orders, when that person comes, separates the applicant immediately and will keep them in a room or keep them somewhere else so they don't have to stand out in the hallways pre-COVID days facing their accuser. And so that was one of the ways the courts almost always did it. I know, at least in our particular court in El Paso, we had a room that all of the victims would come sit in before court so that they would not be out with the general public.
Yeah. Right. No, that's exactly how it's been when I've been there too. It's where there's like an advocacy group or it was basically just an advocacy room where we would hold the survivor in that room, and then we would get called in by the judge. We would come in, and then the judge would actually hold that abuser in court to give us enough time to get out and away before that they allowed that person to leave the room.
And that's exactly what we did as well. Now, one of the interesting things that I think COVID in particular has caused is the advancement of courts in areas that they were not necessarily advanced in before. COVID required courts to become immediately up to speed on Zoom technology, remote hearing technology. And honestly, I don't know why now in protective orders, we can't have the victim sitting in another room testifying via video. Because at least in Travis County, every 100%. Courtroom was equipped with a screen and an Elmo. There's no reason not to do it now.
Right.
But I don't think that would have happened or that kind of idea would have occurred but for COVID.
Another interesting COVID concern has been the escalation in domestic violence concerns. Are you seeing those same stats, those same trend lines?
What we are seeing is that substance abuse is exponentially increasing during COVID, and along with substance abuse comes domestic violence. It's almost hand in hand.
Well, also financial difficulty is another.
Financial difficulties will cause it absolutely as well, but very few cases do you see domestic violence where alcohol or some kind of cocaine is not being used. It's predominantly in most domestic violence situations.
One of the things that I always found concerning is why is domestic and intimate partner violence considered a civil case? Like, why is that not an assault charge?
Well, there may be an accompanying assault charges at the same time.
On the criminal side.
That system is much slower, and at least during COVID is basically ground to a halt. In the civil side on protective orders, you can get into court much, much quicker. I mean, you can, from the time of the incident, get an emergency magistrate's protective order that lasts anywhere up to 90 days if a deadly weapon is used. And so that gives them immediate protection. And then beyond that, you can get into the courts. You go down to the county attorney's office, apply for your protective order. You can be in a court that afternoon with your affidavit seeking one under the Texas Family Code. And then you're in court, depending on the size of your county, 2 to 3 weeks later by statute, having your application heard. And that's so much faster than the criminal side of it.
And then what would your advice be to someone who is hit for the first time? Is that the time to get a temporary restraining order? In order to come before a court and get a full restraining order, does there really need to be a repeated pattern in practice for that protection to be put in place?
Once is enough. Case law, at least in Texas, is very clear that just one incident of domestic violence is enough to show that there's a future likelihood of it to occur again in the future. So you don't need to be hit more than once to go apply for one.
And then one of the things we discussed offline previously was the sometime escalation into the stalking concern, which doesn't always begin as a domestic violence issue, but very often does. What kind of how advanced, how caught up to speed, especially with the advent of social media and cyber harassment and cyber stalking and social media threats and all of that stuff, has the court caught up to the technology in terms of the stalking concern that really does have, I don't want to say on so many people, but on too many people.
Stalking, as I think I indicated to you before when we were talking, is one of the scariest types of. It's not really domestic violence, but to me, it is where the most danger exists. And unfortunately, a lot of our judges are of an older generation. Typically, by the time you get to run for judge, you're much older and they're probably not as technologically savvy. And so they don't, I mean, I'm at 43 and don't understand TikTok. My kids understand it, but if you're looking at a judge that's in their late 50s, early 60s, I don't know if they're going to understand the impact that social media has. And so while I know the judges training tries to get them up to speed to explain to them how damaging this can be, I don't know that they have caught up with it. And there are some that just don't believe that chasing someone down the freeway is stalking.
Well, that's concerning. And then especially when there is that intimacy effect, like how well versed do you find that judges, prosecutors, and even public defenders or public advocates, how well versed are they on some of the, the more nuanced essence of threat management, like the intimacy effect, where a history of violence plus stalking is a greater indicator of lethality than either indicator alone.
Yes, stalking is bad news.
Right.
There's no way other than it's bad news. I think that the career prosecutors, and I can say that because I'm married to one. My husband was a prosecutor for almost
Right.
30 years. The prosecutors that do this for a living, I think they understand it really, really well. I think the individuals that represent the applicants in protective orders understand it really, really well. I don't know that everyone else does. Unless you specialize in it, it's hard to really understand just how scary the stalkers are.
And what advice would you give to someone from a from the vantage point of a judge, but also as a family law practitioner? What are the best strategies that someone who feels that they are being harassed or who are being stalked should employ to ensure the certainty of their safety?
Well, there's no guarantees right in life, but one of the things you really do is you don't engage. Do not engage with the person that is stalking, harassing you, and really go to the authorities. That's the best solution because you can't solve the problem yourself. You can't. And I think if you try to, you're at more risk.
What did you So one of the things that I always advise, so with my firm, my my fee schedule is high, and so a lot of times the clients who need my services can't come to me directly, which is why we offer the pro bono services to these advocacy groups, because they're coming to us. And one of the things we always find is that the the more in depth your narrative, the more in depth your case file, the more examples that you can cite in a case file when you go to when you go to the police to file your report, the higher the level of your or the higher degree of success will be, because you want to say, hey, on this time they did this, on this time they did that, here's the footage from my Ring camera, here's the footage from my Nest Cam, on this date I told them to stop, here's a text message where I told them to stop, and then here's the 100 text messages, the 15 emails, the 32 voicemails, and the 10 times they tried to show up at my door.
I agree with you on that. It is always better to paper the file and paper their case. I agree with you. One of the ways we always tell people, I know I tell clients, it goes back a little bit to divorce. The beauty of a divorce is you don't have to deal with the person anymore. You can block them. You can, I mean, minus if you have kids at issue, but you don't have to answer their phone call. And
Right.
so some of the same applies to stalking. However, if you don't do that, then you don't have the evidence to show that they're harassing you.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's a catch 22.
It's a catch 22. And it's also one of those things where, you know, I see this with inappropriate pursuit all the time. The guy calls the girl 10 times. She doesn't answer. She answers on the 11th. All she's done is reframe the expectation in that guy's mind. Oh, now I just have to call her 15 times.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It's like they're just throwing out baiting language. They're throwing out all these things. And the other thing is that their first response or their first reaction is to block them. And if you block them, then one, it turns into a cat and mouse game where they're just going to change up their number. Whereas if you just send them to voicemail, we're still getting that information. The texts are still coming through. We're still getting the voicemails. They're still showing up in your call log. So that kind of information is also very helpful. And
the do not disturb, yeah, it would be helpful.
Right, exactly. Or just mute the conversation so you're still getting it, but it's not showing up in your notifications and adding to that burden of anxiety. And another thing is, would you recommend when they do want to make that initial report that they try to identify a special task force or a detective? Or because to be perfectly honest with all due respect to the first responders and the ladies and gentlemen who patrol our streets, the patrol sector of police departments isn't always as well informed on how to handle these types of cases as we would prefer.
Well, and I don't think it's possible for them to be, because they cover such a wide variety of calls.
Completely agree.
I mean, it has to be a specialized team.
To be very, very clear that I'm in no way, shape, or form saying that this is their fault. What I'm trying to do is educate the listeners on best course of action.
So I think as you find typically when you file a case, your case will be assigned to a detective. You make sure you have that detective's contact information so that you can stay in touch with them. And if there are more incidences that occur, that you report them to that detective specifically. So you got to have a person to hang on to. Otherwise, you get shuffled around.
Right.
And you call the main desk and they'll transfer you to 18 other different detectives. But you get a hold of a name, an individual there that can actually respond to you and keep you updated. Is really how you get that done.
Right. And so you would recommend calling the actual police department and asking for a detective?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I want the detective.
As opposed to calling 911.
Well, okay. If your life is in danger,
is in immediate danger, of course, call 911 immediately.
Call 911.
But if you are in a safe place and you are of peace in mind and sound peace in mind to file a grievance, a detective is the best course of action.
Because if that detective already has an active case, they just add that to it. And some crimes are continuing course of conduct and upgrade the level of the offense to a felony. And so while it may not be,
especially if there's a history of domestic violence, or if they're on parole for something else, or even when we're dealing with the public figure sector, we find that this may be the first time that they're harassing this particular public figure, but they have a long history of harassing other public figures in the past, which this adds another key ingredient to that overarching case file. We always talk, and I know that from being on the bench, you're very familiar with the term totality of circumstance, where just because your individual piece may seem insignificant, when added to the greater whole, it could be the link that they needed to tie it all together.
And stalkers in particular is the totality of the circumstances.
Is there anything that you think that just the everyday person can do to sort of, have you noticed any similarities or like overarching narratives or key ingredients that sort of serve as the warning signs that lead people into these, tumultuous times? Is it, the first time he hits you, he's going to hit you again? Is it the first time you feel like you're being followed, report it? I know that listen, I don't have any two cases that have ever been the same, but when you look back, there's always that turning point where someone went, I just knew something wasn't right.
The older I've gotten, the more I've realized you have to trust your gut.
Yes.
And when you're young, you ignore your gut a lot. And you see red flags or you see stop signs and you blow right through them. You're like, oh no, he'll change or she'll change. Mm-hmm. You've got to trust your gut. If there's a red flag because he doesn't like you being around your friends when he's around, get out.
Yes.
And understand, I've seen the reverse on women as well.
Listen, yes. Yes.
If she stabbed you once, she's gonna stab you again. Get out. Because you think common sense, right? No, I've had a case where the guy was stabbed 3 different times by the same woman.
Right.
At what point don't you get she's going to kill you? If a person chokes you and restricts your airway, I don't care what anyone says, they're trying to kill you.
Strangulation is huge. I mean, that's like of all of the physical abuses, strangulation is the most lethal, and you almost always see that right when the person who is being abused tries to leave.
Right.
That is typically the most dangerous time in the relationship because they've communicated their desire to leave rather than just leaving.
Because the abusers lost control.
Right, and they will go up and right on their on their employment of violence to regain control. And
they will
strangulation is almost always employed.
But and that's the other thing is that early on in a relationship, if someone chokes you, and it's male or female, that person's trying to kill you. It's not an if and or but about it. If you're trying to restrict someone's airway, that's a red flag. I mean,
no, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, the answer is, and I'll give you a case that I had in my court once where we had a gentleman who looked like a typical frat boy. You wouldn't think anything wrong with this person. And he met this girl at a party and brought her back to her apartment. And she had an inkling like, I shouldn't go up. He's like, no, come up. It'll just be for a second. We'll go to another party. The minute they got to her apartment, he slit her throat open. She lived to tell the tale. But she ignored her gut.
Yeah.
You can't ever ignore your gut. And that's a hard thing to do. Because I know as a kid or younger, in my 20s, but
I was working a case, it was like 2 weeks ago. It's a sexual assault case. And the woman, it was like, he wasn't a stranger. And they kind of knew each other like socially. And he had gotten a new puppy and he was like, oh, do you want to come over and see the new puppy? And she was like, oh, I would love to. And he's like, oh, well, I'm right down your street. Why don't you just come and I'll pick you up. And so she was like, okay. And went over and then got to the house and there was no puppy in sight. And the guy was like, oh yeah, he's in the other room. And as soon as she heard the door close behind her, she was like, this isn't right. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I always encourage people is that your unwillingness to offend another should never be greater than your willingness to defend yourself. And she didn't want to be rude.
So you get to be rude.
Yeah. And so she was like, but she said, like, in my mind, I was like, well, do I make a run for it? Do I go out the door? Like, what do I do? And I was like, yeah, run. Like, if your mind is screaming, this isn't bad, run. Put as much time and distance between you and the threat as possible.
And this is going to sound colloquial, but honestly, if your animals don't like the person,
100%,
it's a red flag, people.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a meme or an anecdote or a quote, but it's like, I don't always dislike people that don't like my dog, but I always trust my dog when he doesn't. I got that wrong, but you know what I'm saying.
I know what you're saying, but honestly, if your animal, dogs, I've got cats and dogs, but my dog in particular, if my dog doesn't like you, there's a reason for it.
And the reason is that the dog is picking up on your pheromone change. Mm-hmm. The dog senses your internal fight or flight biology changing. And because of that is protecting you. Mm-hmm. That's 100% what is happening.
Yeah,
your dog is picking up on your nonverbal communications that your own brain isn't able to process.
Right, because our brain is so flooded with social mores and what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to be polite. And your mother said never to do this, but we live in dangerous times, unfortunately, and you have to look out for yourself. And that is, I know, because I've got 5 kids total. My husband and I have his 2 girls that are 26 and 23, and then my boys are 17, 15, and 5.
Right.
And I remember coming home after that case from that girl and telling my stepdaughters, because I raised them, but telling them, look, don't go home with it. They may look okay. Don't do it. You've got to make sure you know the people.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I always preach to my clients is like all most people need to stay safe is a healthy sense of skepticism and a moderate dose of vigilance. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to completely ignore your own, innate self of defense, sense of self defense, then you're really sabotaging your own success when it comes to staying safe.
And the other thing, really, so many people, and I think COVID's made this worse, are afraid of being alone, and so they're willing to tolerate
Yes,
things that they wouldn't normally because they're so afraid of being alone. And if the one thing people could understand is there will always be someone else. I've done divorce law for a living for almost 20 years, and there is always someone else.
of course, of course. And
Um,
Mark Manson is a favorite author of mine. Posted something the other day. It was along the lines of, the longer you stay in the relationship that makes you unhappy, the more you're preventing the relationship that will make you happy from reaching fruition.
it's true.
And
And
we sometimes as humans try to make the bad relationship good instead of, trying to find the relationship that is good.
right. And I think that's a lot of reasons why people still stay. Um,
Right. A
and
yes
if
to someone else should never come at the cost of a no to you.
right. And anyways, so that's the other thing is there will be someone else. I've done this for a very long time. I unfortunately divorced lots of people, but they almost always find someone else.
Of course, because they're,
But
yeah, you can't make someone else happy unless you're happy. You can't empower someone else unless you're empowered. And it's like one of those things where, I mean, I have a whole chapter in my book about like the safety trap of being too polite. And
mhm,
it's always because, we don't want to offend another. Like I said before, our unwillingness to offend another sometimes comes at the cost of defending ourselves.
there is an immense power in using the word no.
Yes, it is. Gavin DeBecker, my former mentor, former employer, author of the book Gift of Fear, used to always say, no is a one word sentence.
Mhm,
And
no,
the thing is that it is the end of the conversation, not the beginning of the negotiation. Just no.
I love the word no.
The older I get, the more I use it. I wish I had said it more when I was younger.
No is a very powerful word that more people need to use. Instead of saying, "Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that," when they really don't want to, just say no.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this conversation. Trust your gut, just say no, and when in doubt, get out.
Get out. Absolutely. Thanks.
Michele,
You
thank you
have
so
a
much.
great rest of
I
your
appreciate
day.
you. Cheers.
Bye.